After 80 hours of playtime, I recommend Together in Battle for any fan of mechanically deep turn-based strategy RPGs. If that's all you want to know, feel free to click away now, but consider liking and dropping a sub first. That said, I do have some caveats, so if you want to know more about what those caveats are, or just why I recommend this game, watch on. My name is Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman, and welcome back to the channel. When it comes to reviewing titles like Together in Battle, there's a ton of work that goes into ensuring I've done due diligence for all of y'all and for the game and its dev. To make it happen, I rely on the dedication of my channel supporters on Patreon and my YouTube members, whose names you'll see scrolling by at the end of the video. Thank you to all of you, and if you want to join those names, you'll find links in the description. Seriously, thank you all. I don't know that I'd still be able to do this without your support. So what is Together in Battle? TIB is a grid-based Fire Emblem/FFT style tactics title with a fairly straightforward premise. You take the role of the owner and manager of a team of gladiators. As such, your days are spent fighting in the arena, managing supplies and food, caring for your team, and raising them into a resistance force trying to solve the murder of the local Surf King and evade capture by a local official. Okay, yeah, there's some complexity to the plot here, but we'll talk about that in a minute, and definitely it is a good time, so don't be too dissuaded by that. The general gameplay loop is this. Fight in the arena, earn gold, recruit new heroes, and buy them gear/food, take on odd jobs for extra cash, investigate the succession plot, repeat. Toss in periodic qualifier matches and league bouts as part of the story, and that's your daily schedule. When you're on the field, any tactics player should feel right at home. Turns alternate between player and enemy phases, units have individualized classes and abilities, you can equip different weapons and armor, use consumables, etc., etc. When units get to level 20, they promote to a new class. Skills and weapons can inflict status effects. There's mages, swordsmen, cavalry, flyers, healers, rogues, and fun utility options like engineers. The relationships between your units matter. Hell, depending on your difficulty, you even have permadeath. Yet there's even more that's stacked on top of all of that. Now, one thing I want to address right off the bat, because it's probably the number one critique I've seen of Together in Battle when I've covered it in the past, is the visuals and the art style. So many people tell me that they are immediately put off of the game due to the way that it looks. And while I get that, I think anyone who enjoys a deep, robust, turn-based strategy RPG, turn-based tactics, however you want to call it, style game, whoever wants to enjoy an experience that actually has meat on its bones in this genre, owes it to themselves to check this one out. Use the demo if that's what you want to do. Watch gameplay footage, whatever you want. Don't let yourself be turned off by the visuals. They actually grow on you quite a bit. There's no other game to me that looks like Together in Battle other than its prequel, Telepath Tactics, which I've not actually had the chance to play myself yet, but I digress. And I enjoy it being what it is. There's a blend of sort of like realism with a little bit of cartooniness. I like the way that the maps and the battle sprites look. I enjoy the way everything is put together, and it does actually flow pretty well with itself once you learn what the game is actually doing. Recognizing the different character classes, recognizing different features of the battle map, etc., becomes much easier once you kind of let yourself appreciate what the game is. And I get that's a big ask. I know people are very visually coded nowadays, like more so than they ever have been in the history of video games, and people were already very biased when it came to visuals. But if you are someone that enjoys games in this genre, I promise you, there's a very good chance that you will actually enjoy what you experience here if you look beyond the visuals and the effects. We'll talk about that more in depth in a later section, but I wanted to address it now because I know there's going to be a lot of people that have a lot to say about it. The main plot of Together in Battle is interesting, as we previously mentioned. You feature a triple layer of a resistance fighter training recruits who is posing as a gladiator team manager while also having to actually function as a successful gladiator team manager, while also getting wrapped up in a regicide plot.
After weeks at sea, you have at last arrived in Kalkerapur, sun-scorched capital of the island nation of Desi. As you alight from the ship, you find yourself lurching to and fro, shifting to counteract the rocking of a sea that no longer lies beneath you. You lean against a post and rest as your brain reorients itself to solid land. Why were you ordered to come here again? Ah, right. you remember. The rebels need troops with combat experience and an experienced commander to lead them. The Imperial Tournament should help take care of both problems at once. You find your way to the market, where you spend several hours securing the necessary food and supplies. The task complete, you make for the outskirts of Kalkerapur to pitch camp. Tomorrow morning you will return and visit the recruitment office. What kind of allies will you find? Will they get along? Will you be up to the task of directing them in the chaos of battle?
You have interesting plot angles, compellingly unique world building, interesting integration of racial pressures with fantasy elements. Elements of the plot can leave you questioning who's in the right, who might be guilty, and who is a red herring, etc., etc. I've often said that while I am very much someone who cares a lot about story and character writing in turn-based strategy games, it's definitely a more secondary facet of the genre. For example, I remember a lot about the story of Final Fantasy Tactics because it's very, very strong. I don't remember nearly as much about Final Fantasy Tactics A2 Grimoire of the Rift because it's just less impactful and less important than the clan management, mission-based, loot-based, bizarre gameplay. Together in Battle manages to get around that by making the navigation of the story very important, not only to how you're going to approach different fights and what you're going to choose to do on any given day, but also what different endings you're potentially going to get, and there's quite a few here. Now, granted, this is no 100-line Last Defense Academy that has literally 100 different endings that can take you God only knows how much time to get, but this is also a game made by a largely solo dev in Sinister Design, so I think we can forgive him that one. There's still a lot of different endings here and a lot of different story routes to explore, and I found myself very much enjoying it, which I wasn't sure that I would at first. While the overall idea of being a resistance fighter who's trying to raise an army to fight back against a corrupt slave trading mining company is relatively relegated to the beginning and end of the game, it is still something that is present. What's more impactful is the rigors and sort of rigmarole that you have to go through to be able to manage your gladiator team and the different characters that you're going to interact with as you do so, as well as the regicide plot that you get sucked into at the very beginning of the game, which you then need to figure out how to navigate through investigations, interrogating different characters, going on different story battles outside the normal loop of gladiator arena fights, etc., etc. That makes things very interesting and keeps things very fresh as well. Very often these different fights and encounters that you wind up finding yourself in as part of the investigation function very differently from the gladiatorial bouts that you're probably used to by the point you start doing them, and it means you actually have to start thinking outside the box of what you're comfortable with for said gladiatorial fights. You know, most of the time you have 6, 7, maybe 8 characters that you're relying on for your gladiator fights. You know what skills they require. You know generally what sort of gameplay you're going to engage in to isolate certain members of the enemy team and pick them off one at a time, all that type of good stuff. And then you find that these investigation fights are much broader in scope and require a much different lens, where certain characters and classes shine a lot more than others. Typically, you have much larger fights, much larger maps, more units that you can bring to the table, and various different bonus objectives and mechanics that make you keep thinking on your feet, which I do very much enjoy, but which can also wind up being frustrating your first couple of times through, which is something we're going to talk about in the cons section near the end of the video. As far as the overall story is concerned, though, I do very much enjoy it. There's some interesting twists and a lot of integration of the fairly unique world building that Together in Battle has, using psychic, telepathic individuals who can read minds, mind control people. The fact that the entire kingdom that you're operating in is basically a serfdom of a different, larger kingdom, and how those politics interact with the king and prince and guards and everyone else that you wind up talking to. It makes things a little bit grander in scope as far as the world itself is concerned, while still allowing you to stay fairly focused on the gladiator storyline while figuring out what happened to the king of the realm, and I really enjoy it. Thus far, I've only gotten one ending in the game, despite my 80 hours of playtime, because partially I was playing an early access version of the build for quite a while, where some of the different endings and features and mechanics and stuff weren't included yet, so I just started a bunch of different runs, but also just there's a lot to explore here, and it's fairly easy to find yourself falling into one or another ending by not following certain plot lines through to completion or not completing the investigation, all that type of good stuff. It means that there's a lot of replayability here here in terms of the story writing itself beyond any of the gameplay, and I think it's definitely one of the game's strengths, even if you might not think so right off the bat. As far as the character writing itself is concerned, mainly your interesting bits are going to come from the main plotline of the investigation, as well as the way that your characters interact with one another, as Together in Battle definitely places a focus on your characters' relationships and their personalities, and what they kind of roll each time you start a game. Each character is completely randomly generated and will be created not only with a different class and stats and specialities and everything else, but also different personality quirks that will come out over time as they interact with you and the rest of the party. You'll find everything from stereotypical lover boys to shonen vengeance-focused protagonists to whimsical joke makers who wind up having a dark secret backstory that leaves them kind of paralyzed in certain situations, to motherly or fatherly figures and people who are just out to make a quick bucket. You have a large range of different personalities on offer, which, when you consider the fact that everything is randomly generated as far as your player characters are concerned, is extremely impressive. Combine on top of that the fact that people can actually create their own characters for this game and put them in the game, a la things like XCOM 2, with their own story writing, own background, own personality quirks, and everything else. And there's a ton of depth here in terms of how customizable your player characters are going to be. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, okay, but there's only one campaign, isn't there, Tom? At base, yes. However, Together in Battle also features a large custom campaign creator, so while you do have a very well fleshed out main storyline that you can explore to your heart's content with multiple different endings and the like, you can also use the template created by Sinister Design to make your own custom campaigns and essentially have as much fun as you want in this sandbox, which is a ton of fun. You're also able to make the game a bit of a roguelite if you so choose. It's not the primary game mode, I would personally say, but if you do want to play the game as a roguelite, as an Iron Man, with constant auto-saving and the like, you can choose to do so. And I will say, given the fact that my 80 hours of the game have all been spent playing it as a roguelite, things get very intense and sometimes very infuriating, which for those of you who love this type of genre and love that type of challenge can very well be a good thing, as it is for me. I say this in spite of all of the many expletives that I've thrown out into the world, as I find myself with my back against the wall in various circumstances of my own making, or just at the mercy of the RNG, which, you know, is definitely a thing. Call me a masochist if you want, but sometimes it's just finding a way out of a poor situation in a tactics game and actually being able to push forward with success is far more satisfying than just rolling face over everything for the course of the entire game. So before we get into the gameplay and mechanics, I do very quickly want to touch on the art style and visuals, as well as the OST and the sound effects, as I think there's a lot to say here, and while I personally push these things to the side a little bit when it comes to turn-based strategy RPGs, I know a lot of people can't, and that's fair, so let's talk about it. As far as art style and visuals, again, I mentioned it at the top of the video, but this is definitely something that is going to take a little bit of getting used to. I initially was not super impressed with the visuals of Together in Battle. I was a little bit off-put by the character portraits and how seemingly simplistic some of the maps were, but when you consider that A, this is a largely solo dev project, and B, you actually wind up getting very used to these portraits and this overall sprite work pretty quickly, because it's fairly unique in terms of the overall landscape of the strategy RPG genre. I think there's actually more positives here than people are initially going to give the game credit for. I actually do really like the way Together in Battle looks now that I've spent so much time with it. It is absolutely distinct from anything else that I've played, and it's not actually like bad in any way. It's just different. I don't hate it. I actually kind of like it. Like, are there things that could be refined? And if you had like a dedicated art team, like, of course, sure, I totally get that. But on its face, for what it is, things look good. Characters are recognizable, especially when you consider the fact that they're all modular and completely randomized. Like, things work together. The color palette works for an overall bright and interesting fantasy world. You have a variety of different types of character designs that mean all of the characters that you recruit and that you wind up fighting are going to be very distinct from one another, and you'll be able to tell them apart easily. Speaking of telling things apart easily, on the battle map, you can tell what's what. All of the sprites are well designed. You can absolutely tell at a glance what each character is, what terrain features you're dealing with, what sorts of different effects are happening. And that's before you even get into the actual effects of attacks and things, which I think are actually quite good. I love all the different weapon animations. I love all of the different spell animations. The game has a life to it in motion that I feel like doesn't come across super well right off of the bat, but once you actually spend some time with it, you'll come to appreciate more and more. Combine that with the fact that I think that all of the static backgrounds actually look really nice, whether you are training or on a battle map or in the city doing different odd jobs or managing your team or in the camp, seeing what characters have to say to each other, throwing a feast or having a one-on-one with a character or just seeing what people do over the course of the night. There's a lot of nice imagery here that kind of has a little bit of a visual novel style, and I like it. It's really quite enjoyable, actually. And I think the fact that I've spent so much time with the game tells you that you don't really wind up being turned off by it, or at least I didn't. And from what I've seen of a lot of people talking about the game in my comments and in other areas around the internet, there's a lot of similar consensus regarding the visuals here. So if you're someone that's feeling a little bit put off by it, give it another shot. I think you might find yourself actually coming around to it. For the OST and the sound effects, I think there's a lot less to potentially be critical of right off the bat. I really enjoy all the music in the game. As always, you'll be able to hear a bunch of it over the course of the background of this video. But it's dynamic, it's fun, it's whimsical, it's serious. It has a lot of appropriate different energy for different scenes and different things that you're doing over the course of the game. And unfortunately, a lot of games don't quite nail that. Like, even my personal game of the year, Dark Deity 2, I mentioned one of my critiques of it was the fact that sometimes, while the OST was always good, there were times where it just didn't fit what was happening. And I never really felt that with Together in Battle. The use of different instruments and synths and themes in the overall musical composition really kind of fits the vibe of this desert gladiatorial setting that we exist in, which is very different from a lot of other games in the genre that I've played. And it makes things come alive in a way that I feel like would be very easy to screw up in a game like this. As far as the actual sound effects are concerned, I'm definitely on board with them. Weapon hits feel punchy, spell casts are loud and impactful, but they maybe are a little limited. A lot of different spells and ranged attacks sound very similar, and sometimes there's some sound balancing overall that can be a little bit grating, especially if you're using headphones, so you might want to adjust some settings in the overall settings menu, but for what the sound effects are trying to convey, I think they do their job and they're perfectly fine. They're not the best that I've heard in the genre, but they're not overall offensive either, other than a little bit of repetitiveness and potentially some volume issues. Moving on from visuals and OST, the biggest and most important aspect of any turn-based strategy RPG is, of course, its gameplay and its mechanics. As far as Together in Battle is concerned, we're going to be breaking this section into three major facets: combat gameplay, army management, and classes and abilities, in that order. So let's talk about the combat and gameplay. Missions in Together in Battle typically take place in a gladiatorial arena where over time the team sizes increase, starting with 6 up to 7, 8, 9, potentially even 10, with other outlier missions such as special events or investigation missions, potentially allowing you to bring more units to the table. These normal gladiatorial missions take place on fairly small maps, although again, other maps can be far larger and allow different strategies, and everything that you would pretty much expect from other games in the genre are here. Turns take place on a player turn, enemy turn structure, although sometimes special mechanics will make it so that the enemy actually gets to go first, which can be quite scary. Each of your units has a certain distance that they can move, as well as being able to take one major action per turn. Outside of certain special things things like picking up items or special abilities that specifically state that they do not end their turn. Once all of your units have ended their turn, it will move to the enemy turn, they will take their actions and repeat. Similarly to Fire Emblem, each of your units will have different weapons that they can equip within certain weapon archetypes. Those weapons will have durability as well as different stats, and you will have the option to choose what weapon you want to use prior to attacking. This means that often you will find yourself wanting to equip a stronger or weaker weapon depending on the circumstance available to preserve other weapons that you have in your character's inventory. Speaking of which, every character does have their own inventory, which includes their weapons, their armor, and their consumables, and those are things you're going to be managing and upgrading over the course of a campaign. On the battlefield, you have just as many different combat options as you would expect. There are terrain difficulties that you have to deal with that are either going to completely block forward progress, such as trees and rocks. You will also find yourself dealing with things like high scrub brush that will give you extra dodge or give the enemy extra dodge if they find themselves in it, as well as water and pits that enemies or you can find yourself being thrown into. And this is a major aspect of the gameplay of Together in Battle that I find really compelling about the title as a whole. You see, there's a big focus here on being able to move your units and enemy units around, either physically or magically, and using the terrain to your advantage as a result. Magic spells will light grass on fire. Rivers, you can shove people into them and they can't fight back as they're trying to swim their way out. Pits, you can just fall into or shove someone else into and permanently remove a unit from the board, etc., etc. Utilizing the terrain to your advantage is absolutely vital to success in Together in Battle, and especially on higher difficulties such as Challenging Plus, the enemy will absolutely be doing the same to you. So it's very important that you hammer into your head early that you need to analyze what terrain you're working with and how you can use it to your advantage. Hell, even just height advantages is a major issue here. If you have the low ground, you're going to deal less damage and potentially have less accuracy, and if the enemy has the high ground, they're going to deal more damage and have better accuracy. Some terrain is going to be so high that you can't even jump up to it or jump down from it, which is going to massively impact your ability to navigate around the battlefield. And that's to say nothing of the fact that every single unit, allied, enemy, or neutral, cannot be moved through unless you have specific abilities or specific skills that allow you to do so. So positioning and intelligently moving your team around is going to be massively important here. This is one of the things that I love the most about Together in Battle is its realism. Every facet of a battlefield is important here. The order in which you move your guys so you can take the maximum advantage of their range and their mobility is huge. Being able to use the terrain to your advantage to position enemies in range of being shoved into a bottomless pit, or ranging them out using terrain that they can't navigate through, or using classes like the Engineer to build terrain that then blocks off major choke points, allowing you to focus down enemies and focus your damage, will all be massively important here, and it's something that I haven't seen from a lot of other games in the genre, and it is a major reason why I love this one so much. But of course, this is probably the biggest hurdle for Together in Battle as well. Being able to actually wrap your brain around the fact that the navigation and utilization of terrain is possibly more important than any class or equipment that you have on hand is something that a lot of people I feel like aren't really going to be able to bring themselves to very easily, and I see it being a major factor in the sort of head against wall bashing frustration that games like this that have a little bit of an older design style to them can kind of bring people to. Every move you make is going to have to be calculated. Maybe you need to move this mage into position to get a shot off on an enemy to soften them and immobilize them, right? However, trying to do so is going to body block you from getting your Cavalier into range to deal some major damage. So, you need to move the Cavalier first, get him in melee range with the enemy that you're trying to shoot with the mage, then have the mage follow up afterwards so that everyone's in the proper position, because moving does not automatically end your turn in this game. You can take your shot with the mage, weaken the enemy that you're targeting, have the Cavalier finish them off, bada boom, bada bing, Bob's your uncle, you're moving forward. And I love that about Together in Battle. Actually having every individual movement you make matter so much clicks so well in my strategic brain once I actually get myself into gear with what the game wants from me. This is not a Fire Emblem situation where you get one move and whether you use all your movement points or not, you're just done. You have a set amount and you can use them so long as you don't take an action that winds up breaking them. You have consumables, you can use them, and it doesn't end your turn. It gives you the chance to patch up wounds, buff stats, do other fun things in relation to that. Different equipment will give you different abilities, and you can equip it to not only get offensive benefits, but also defensive benefits. Destroying terrain can wind up giving you different items such as fruits that will give you HP and energy back. There's treasure chests on the battlefield that you are highly encouraged to seek out and destroy for bonus gold, item, healing, etc. There's a lot of variety to every map here, and that's before you even get into different objectives such as King of the Hill or capture or defend the idol, where you actually have different game modes that you need to engage with on a kind of random basis as you wind up taking on different missions in the arena. And that's what brings me back. Every time I go into a fight, every time I complete a day, or every time I go on a different overall income mission, I never know what I'm going to face. Sometimes that is incredibly frustrating, and I very much liken it to my first time experiencing a new Souls game, for example, right? Where you wander into a new area, fight a new enemy, and they pull off some absolute malarkey that leaves you dead and yelling at your screen, well, that was some bullshit. What the hell is that? And then you sit back and you think, okay, this is a learning experience. How can I use the tools that I have available to me to conquer this challenge and keep moving forward? And that is Together in Battle for me, and I love that. When it comes down to your actual army management, a lot of the gameplay frustration in Together in Battle can be heightened or mitigated by the way that you handle things, which of course is how it should be in any sort of turn-based strategy RPG, team building, army building game, especially one where you're actually managing a squad of gladiators, right? But what actually goes into that in this game? Compared to a lot of other titles, quite a bit. Right off the bat, of course, you do have to recruit your various generics. You'll start off by recruiting 6 at the beginning of the game out of a pool of randomly generated 12. And then at pretty much any point during your gameplay, you can decide to go back to the recruitment office and pick up some more randomly generated units. You'll be able to see what their class is, what their abilities are, what proficiencies they have with different skills, what stat spreads they might have, as well as how much they want you to pay them, not only to recruit them, but also on a bi-weekly basis. However, this is not the only way that you're going to be able to get characters. Sometimes you will actually find story events where you'll be able to talk to a character in a battle to recruit them to your side. Other times you'll have random salesmen come up who have golems or the like available, or even random spirits that may appear, etc., etc. There are definitely a bunch of different ways to acquire characters for your army. However, the primary way that you do so will be through the recruitment office. This is perhaps one of the most important decisions that you can make in the game when you decide to bring in a character to your army or not, as not only do you have to make sure that you're doing the best that you can with what options are being presented to you, you also need to make sure that you have a varied enough team to handle whatever scenario is thrown your way, while also being able to feed them and pay their wages. And oftentimes, a really good-looking character is going to be far too expensive for you to be able to bring into your army without potentially crippling yourself or kicking other people out. Given how many different playable races and classes there are in Together in Battle, this can be a very difficult thing to wind up balancing. And over the course of my various runs, there's actually certain types of characters that I just never really had the chance to use, either tactically or because they didn't really show up for me. And that makes it interesting because it means that future runs, I will have very different options that I can try to make use of, which could of course then lead to a very different gameplay experience. Now, we did mention wages and food, so we'll talk about that really quick next. The biggest limiting factor that you're going to have in terms of how well set up your team is going to be is gold. To get the most amount of gold, you're going to have to go into the arena. Going into the arena means characters are going to get tired. They're potentially going to die depending on what difficulty you're on. You could even just lose, which is devastating, especially if it's at a bad time during the course of the month. But other options like finding random loot, selling things that you pick up, or doing odd jobs just won't make those bills be paid. If you don't have enough wages to keep the army happy, their morale is going to drop extremely quickly. They'll take stat penalties, and eventually they may just leave the army entirely. So you absolutely need to make sure that every 2 weeks you meet your minimum wage quota. Of course, you'll also have to balance this by like getting armor and new weapons and paying for trips to the infirmary and the trainer and all sorts of other things. So you will be spending the majority of your time figuring out what you can afford to do with your team. Part of that will be, of course, buying food for them, and this is, while less impactful in a direct sense, still just as important. If you can't feed your army, they will also, again, take a massive morale hit, get weaker, etc., potentially even become sick, which can be very, very problematic. And each different character tends to have a different amount of food that they need to eat. Typically, you're going to be looking at 1 to 2 per day, but other characters might have less or more depending on their personal traits and stats. So you always have to keep an eye on this when you're bringing in new characters in terms of how much you're going to be spending regularly on food for the army. Of course, as you might expect, if characters get downed in battle, they will take wounds. If you're on Challenging Plus or potentially a custom difficulty, you could also just have characters die outright, which is obviously not ideal, but otherwise you'll just have characters get downed and be out of action for a certain amount of time, typically based on how severely they were hit and potentially how high their level is. I don't know exactly what the formula here is, but I've had characters be out of the fight for anywhere as little as a day to sometimes upwards of a week, which could be truly problematic to deal with. Once wounded, you're either going to have to let them recover on their own, a very risky proposition if you're playing a game mode that has permadeath, or you're going to have to bring them to the infirmary to spend more money to get them back on their feet more quickly. And notably, it does take time between bouts for your characters to get their HP back as well. So back-to-back fights without going to the infirmary will leave you with less and less health unless you can spend a lot of time and effort using items and magic to heal up, which of course will make it more likely that you will have characters get down and take wounds. So you have to really take care of your team here. Every hit matters, and the ability to cope with that is going to be a very important part of being a manager for this team. The same can be said for your energy levels, and considering that you need energy not only for spells but also for skills, and it can be drained in a number of different ways, means that you'll have to keep a close eye on how much power your team actually has to be able to sling around spells and skills. Again, you can recover some extra energy by going to the infirmary and letting your characters rest, as well as through certain items like mango or various adrenaline pills and the like, or just letting them, rest at camp and not sending them out on bout after bout, day after day. The interplay of the health and energy systems with the requirement for wages and food means that you do want to have a fairly varied cast. You're typically not going to be able to get away with having just 6 characters and just power leveling them to oblivion like you would in like a very focused Fire Emblem game. You're going to want maybe 8, 10, 12, depending on your wage needs, to be able to swap people in and out and have different types of combat covered. But of course, then on the flip side, you're going to be paying more in wages and have more food that you need to consume. So it's a very big balancing act there. Most of the time, I found that the sweet spot is around 9 or 10 typical characters, with some others like golems and spirits and things that don't need wages or energy or food in the same way to round out the force and not be really breaking the bank. If a character does die, it can obviously be very devastating, although even on Challenging Plus, it doesn't tend to happen super often. Usually you're able to get your people recovered in time, but when it does happen, you will very often have the team take a morale hit. You will, of course, lose that unit. You'll also lose their gear, which is one critique that I have about the game. And any characters that have a relationship with them will oftentimes wind up having further emotional issues down the line. Decreased morale, issues with other characters as they try to work through their trauma. Some may just leave entirely or not do what you want them to do. So you need to keep a very close eye out and try to keep your team alive as much as possible. As you level up, you'll see all of the standard things that you would expect from any turn-based strategy RPG. Stats will go up, you'll learn new abilities, eventually you'll get the chance to promote into new classes, all that type of good stuff. However, what I found is that leveling can be quite variable. 2 characters of the same class can wind up having wildly different stats based partially on what their bases were when you first recruited them. That can make it very difficult for them to actually perform in the role that you want them to. So it's extremely important that you pay attention not only to what those bases are, but how they seem to be leveling as they go. Typically, you'll only see a handful of stats increase at a time, and this has led to certain situations where I have characters that by the end game still have like 20 health compared to the rest of my cast's like 70, or physical characters that have basically no strength whatsoever and are hitting like a wet noodle. So I have to then make the choice, do I keep this person around, or do I ditch them, take the morale hit for firing someone, and then bring in someone who's actually more capable? Or will there be the possibility to try and patch them up along the way? With options like the trainer in town, you can spend time and money to get people's stats leveled up manually, although it's not a very cost-efficient process, and especially as you get to higher stat levels, you'll find that the cost exponentially increases So this is an option that, while available, you're going to want to use pretty sparingly and really only to patch something up if you absolutely have to. You'll also find that it's sometimes variable what skills a character will get as they level, or at least it was for me. There were times where I would just expect my fighter, for example, to have the ability to use a particular sword skill, and he just hadn't learned it yet. So again, paying attention to what skills a character has when you go to recruit them, as well as what you might expect them to have for their role, will be vital as well. In terms of personality, every character has things that they like and dislike, aspects to their backstory and history that will potentially influence the way they interact with each other and also with you, as well as the requests that they make of you. Sometimes characters will request a raise, or that you tell them what particular stat or skill you would like them to work on, or potentially ask you to change their class into a different role that they would like more. And acquiescing to these things will make them happier and fight better, but denying these things will also consequently reduce their morale and potentially have them leave entirely. So once again, you have to balance how much you want to kind of capitulate to what your team is asking of you, and how much of a hard-ass manager you need to be and tell them to pound sand for the good of the group, and sometimes for themselves. When it comes to their relationships with each other, this can definitely wind up being very fun to see unfold, as each of the characters does tend to have pretty interesting and fun personalities written for them, but also sometimes two characters will have a spat, they'll have a falling out, maybe they even have a relationship that they break up. And then those characters might actually be worse off in terms of their combat capabilities for a good long while, either due to a broken heart, jealousy, bitterness, etc. Once again, as the manager, it will be your responsibility to be able to play around these issues. And while it is very fun, and it's definitely a very different take on how to play this type of game, it can also get frustrating sometimes, much in the same way things like Darkest Dungeon can get frustrating, where it's like, y'all, please just stop bickering for 2 seconds. We have a big qualifier match tomorrow, and I need y'all to be firing on all cylinders, or we are going to get bodied out there. And they won't. And you know what? You're the one who has to deal with that, big man. Good luck. As far as weapons and armor are concerned, this is probably one of the most standard aspects of Together in Battle. You have different types of light, plate, medium, heavy, cloth, etc. Different potential races have different options that they need for armor and weapons. And while you will get modifiers on certain things, like you might have a flashy helm that not only gives you the standard stats that you would expect from that class of helm, but also makes that character more likely to be targeted, which can be a fun way to kind of change up how your team is interacted with. It's never going to be anything alarmingly crazy until you get to certain named legendary weapons and the like. More often than not, you're looking at a little bit of an extra boost to strength because it does more damage because it's heavier, but also you have less dodge because it's heavier, or sometimes a weapon is light, so it gives you a little bit of extra energy so you can use more skills and spells without as much consequence, all that type of fun stuff. With the weapons, though, is where things can get interesting, as you can have unbreakable weapons with massive increases to stats, maybe the ability to knock characters back or make them grounded if they're flyers, etc., etc. Those you're going to want to keep an eye out for, but I've actually only encountered 2 in my playtime thus far, so they are quite rare. Extremely powerful when you find them, but not something that you're going to be showered with like in some other games. One of the biggest things you have to manage as any sort of manager is time. And that's where you're going to be figuring out how best to use your time when you're in town, when you're back at camp, and when you're trying to take on some extra missions here and there, and how that's going to impact you. Time is the biggest enemy here. You are on a ticking clock. You are moving forward through not just the overall story of the arena, but also the regicide investigation. And the game will not wait for you. It will make you take arena bouts when it says that you're going to. It will throw random events at you that will throw a wrench into your plan. It will not care about your petty problems, and you need to figure out how to handle that. When you're in town, this means deciding what you're going to be doing with your day. Typically, you have 2 energy points per day. Things like going to the arena takes the whole day, whereas hitting up shops only takes 1. So you need to figure out, when do I need to make sure that I'm able to go to the shop to buy food? Or when do I have time to go to the infirmary and drop off a bunch of my characters to get patched up because they're all beat to hell and back? When do I have the opportunity to go and do some odd jobs to make some extra money so that we don't actually wind up having a sort of revolt on our hands when we can't pay our characters' wages? And when do we have the chance to spend the whole day in the arena? This is probably the part of the game that took me the longest to get the hang of, just because I've not really played a lot of games that mess around with a system like this. But once you get the hang of of it and figure out, well, the shop is closed on Monday, but you get a discount on Wednesdays. But sometimes you're going to have a couple of days prior to your payday where you don't really have anything going on, so you can do a bunch of odd jobs then, or even a couple of arena bouts to get some extra gold and get into that flow. It does feel very satisfying, like you actually know what you're doing, which is very nice to feel after struggling and bashing your head against the wall for a while. Now, once you have all of those different aspects of army management down, what are you actually working with here? What classes do you have at your disposal? What types of weapons do they use? And perhaps most importantly, what different playable races are there that all have their own different options? And that's what we're going to talk about next. As far as the playable races that are available, you have a few distinct options. Standard humans, which are going to be, as is typical for these types of games, your most widely versatile with the most number of class options available to them, but with some less impressive overall physical stats and traits. You have Spriggans, little like flying imp-type creatures, which have their own suite of classes. Generally tend to be elemental-based casters, but which also can fly and use claws, so they have a little bit of a well-rounded aspect to them, even if they're kind of squishy. Golems, which, as you might expect, especially if you've played things like Tactics Ogre or Ogre Battle, are pretty slow, but physically very, very menacing, with big AoE attacks, tanky stats, and the ability to throw characters around with reckless abandon. Sprites that are these really cool, almost like ghastly-looking little dudes, notably not spirits. That's a different type of character that we'll talk about in a second. But these pretty universally are mages. They, again, can fly, they can move very far, and typically tend to hit excessively hard, especially when you're fighting them in the arena. So keep an eye out for when the enemy has them, and if you have the opportunity to pick one up for yourself, take care of it, make sure it doesn't die, and it will most likely become one of your most destructive weapons. Next up, you have the lizard folk, which are humanoid, sort of kobold, Komodo dragon types that have one of two different classes that they can choose from. Either high damage melee fighters that are slightly squishy but with a lot of HP and a great ability to deal massive amounts of damage and throw around the enemy while disabling them, or sort of melee shamanistic healers that could still deal good damage in melee and disable the enemy, but are far squishier, with the benefit of then also being able to cast healing spells, so being a nice little jack of all trades there so long as you can keep them alive. I like these guys a lot, even though they're fairly limited, and I made great use of them throughout my campaign. Finally, we have spirits, and spirits are interesting because it feels like you can only get one over the course of the game. Maybe I just didn't get lucky with random events to get more. But this is a very interesting utility piece, as it's essentially functioning as a sort of mage, but more of a support option where you have a lot of ways to drain energy, possess enemies to make them do things that are not in their best interest, and confer energy onto your own guys, kind of like a dancer in a little bit of a way, but instead of giving you extra turns, you're just letting things use their most powerful abilities more often, which, with how powerful some of these spells and skills become, can essentially be the same thing as giving them extra turns. I really like the Spirit. It can be very hard to level, given that it's not as much of a combat class, but once you're able to do so, it becomes a very indispensable part of the team, or at least it did for me. As far as the overall classes in Together in Battle are concerned, they fall into your standard three options: melee, ranged, and mages. For melee, you have options like, medium armored melee sword fighters that are both kind of tanky and pretty decent at damage, can move units around and have a little bit of mobility in that regard. Cavaliers that ride giant mantises into battle, which is very fun, but otherwise operate as you would expect. Long move ranges, wielding lances, again, medium armored, but with the ability to charge into things, knock them around, and stun them, which is very powerful. You have your lightly armored axe fighters that tend to be slightly inaccurate, but have devastating single target and AoE attacks that can do an alarming amount of damage, while also having throwing axes available for a little bit of ranged. And the always irritating to use rogues and assassins, which are extremely squishy, but very mobile, and if they have the opportunity to get behind you, you can pretty much expect to have any given character explode due to multiple stabs to the kidneys. Beyond just those human classes, golems are pretty much going to be your single biggest melee damage dealers and tanks, with two different options in stone golems and copper golems, but they're basically just robots. The stone golems are big single target damage dealers, very tanky, and very fond of picking things up and hucking them across the arena, into pits, into other units, or into walls to either instantly kill them if it's a pit, or deal a huge chunk of damage to whatever it is that got collided with. The robots are my personal favorite, honestly, as they have these awesome buzzsaw attacks where you can hit in a large AoE, different types of AoEs as you level up and get different buzzsaw skills, while also being able to increase their movement speed and heal themselves. Think like Blitzcrank from League of Legends, except instead of having a rocket fist and punching things, you just have a giant buzzsaw on one arm that can cleave through multiple enemies at a time, and you kind of have an idea of how these guys work. I really enjoy them, and most importantly, at least as far as I've seen, and I put them through a lot, they never permanently die, they just get damaged and take some time to repair, which makes them great options to throw into the fray, take a bunch of hits, weaken some things, and then let the rest of your party clean up afterwards. For your ranged units, you're a little bit more limited. You don't really have physical range in anything other than the humans, and for those, you tend to just have your bowmen and your crossbowmen. Bowmen are fairly standard, being able to attack in direct lines with their bows, as well as getting different skills that allow them to attack much further away for a lower accuracy, or potentially at angles that other classes typically cannot hit. They also get some trick shot arrows, like the ability to push things back or hit side to side, but not whatever's directly in front of them. All those sorts of fun options. They're very simple, but they are very effective at their job and are some of the highest range classes in the game, which can make them a major nuisance to deal with, especially if you're able to navigate around terrain and keep the enemy from getting to you while you pepper them with arrows. Crossbowmen are a little bit more of a techie class, although they do have some big damage options as well. They're able to fight a little bit in melee due to a bayonet. They can hold slightly heavier armor, so they're a bit tankier, and they have a major focus on destroying terrain and objects with explosive bolts and the like. They do get one very, very nasty option in their Grape Shot ability, though, that hits in an X-shaped pattern, and as far as I've been able to see, deals way too much damage, especially when the enemy uses it against you. I have very often had half of my team get wiped due to one unfortunately placed Grape Shot that I did not realize the enemy was going to be able to land. Big ouch on this one. If you can get yourself a strong crossbowman that can use Grape Shot, you are going to be in for a very good time. Now, though, we have to get to the mages, and this is one of the places where I feel like Telepath Tactics really shines in terms of its own world building and class design, as rather than having mages that just use, your various different elements, like you have like a black mage that uses fire, lightning, and ice, or a white mage that uses healing magic, etc. Each mage class is extremely specialized into one type of magic and has both offense and defense / support capabilities as a result. For example, you might have a pyromancer that, throws a bunch of fireballs and does a bunch of damage in that regard, but also has the ability to put up walls of flame to damage enemies that try to walk through them and cut off choke points, or the ability to melt enemies or allies that get frozen to allow them to keep taking their actions and not be essentially stunned. Lots of AoE, but you also have support here, and that pretty much goes for all of the other mages as well. You have cryokineticists that, again, as you might expect, use ice, but also are able to put ice armor on your guys to make them more durable, put out allies that are on fire, build ice walls to completely prevent passage, etc. You have photokineticists that use light magic to blind enemies, make your guys harder to see and hit. You have skyokineticists, I believe, I've never actually been able to pronounce it properly, that use dark magic that can be quite devastatingly powerful, but also can immobilize and soften enemies to make it so they can't get to you and take more damage when you hit them. You have regular kineticists that literally just use the force, they just use telekinesis to throw people into pits, to crush them, to knock them to earth if they're a flyer, make it so that they can't actually fly. And you have mentalists that are able to do a lot more mind control, manipulating the way things function, debuffing enemies, buffing your allies, etc. You also, of course, have Psi healers, which are just your typical healers with some extremely powerful single target and AoE healing to round out the bunch, before we even get into Spriggans that have all of their own elemental abilities with big breath attacks and then, of course, their claws. Sprites are going to have all of the same different mage classes that humans have, but generally tend to be a bit better at them while being a bit less durable. And really, if you don't have at least 3 or 4 different types of mage on your team, I don't know what you're doing, man. The whole point of this world is that you've got a bunch of telepaths, you've got a bunch of mages with a lot of different types of magic, and that magic is going to be some of the best ways for you to interact with the world around you. Finally, we do have one other kind of unique class beyond just the spirit, which we already pretty much covered in terms of what it does, and that is the human class of the engineer. This is a fun one that I haven't had the opportunity to use as much as I would like, because I kept getting my engineers killed because they're definitely non-combatants, but you can bonk things with a wrench if you really need to. Their whole facet is basically being Jens from Triangle Strategy, if you're familiar with him. They're going to put down bridges, they're going to put down caltrops, they're going to build walls, put down satchel charges, and generally be a nuisance that manipulates the battlefield to your advantage and to the enemy's disadvantage. They're definitely a lot of fun if you can use them right. They absolutely have a lot of power to them. I've actually, in my most recent run that I started after I started putting this review together, I've been using one to great effect, using caltrops to slow down enemies, deal some damage to them, and generally make certain parts of the map completely non-navigable, which is really great. I love that there's an option like this in Together in Battle, and it just speaks to another way that the game is fairly unique. Now then, with all of the discussion about the game's mechanics and visual presentation and OST and everything else out of the way, let's talk the overall meta view. What are my cons? What are my pros? Who is the game for? And my overall thoughts. I like to try and start with my negatives about games like this in reviews that I do, because while generally, yes, there's always something to critique, I'm covering these games most of the time because I really enjoy them, and I think there's a lot of quality to be had here for people who decide to pick it up. By getting the cons out of the way now, I can show what there is that you need to be worried about if you're having particular concerns about certain aspects of the game, and if those concerns are present in the game, and then we can talk about why I enjoy it so much and end on a lot more of a positive note. So, what are my issues with Together in Battle? First off, as I've kind of alluded to throughout this whole review, the thing can be quite brutal to learn. There's a lot of different mechanics, there's a lot of different overlapping systems, and there's a major focus on being able to plan ahead, which until you kind of get the ropes and kind of maybe get your teeth kicked in a few, maybe dozen times, you're not really going to have the opportunity to do that super well unless you're very intuitive and have a lot of experience with just management systems like this, which for me, I was not. As I've highlighted in the mechanics sections, all of that management is vital to success. You cannot just be a good tactician on the battlefield. You need to know how to maintain your army and navigate the weekly and monthly structure of the game to get the best rewards. The number of times where I've had the inability to buy food because it was a Monday and the shop was closed, but I was out of food and my people were basically threatening to bring me to the guillotine was a little alarming, and that was just poor planning on my part, right? Either I didn't know, or I didn't understand, or I didn't plan ahead, and I got punished for that. And there's a lot of things like that that can happen to you that can be pretty brutal and can be potentially quite frustrating. Once you do learn these things, everything flows. It feels a lot more smooth, a lot more enjoyable. You actually get the idea that you know what you're doing, and that's very satisfying. But until you get to that point, brutality is definitely very high. There were plenty of times where I was cursing at the screen, or I had to take a break and walk away for a little while only to come back later because the game is so compelling, but in the moment, something just untoward happened. Too many bad events in a row, too much bad luck, too many missed attacks, or just things that I either completely forgot I had to plan for, or I had no way of knowing that I needed to plan for, and getting slapped in the face as a result. For a lot of people, of course, you come to games to relax, to have fun, and while tactics gamers tend to be a little bit more used to frustration and difficulty in trying to figure out a way out of a bad situation, things in Together in Battle can hit a peak of frustration that I haven't felt in a long time, and that might be too much for some people. Tied into that is the RNG events, and this is probably the single biggest issue that I have with the game, and there's been a lot of balancing that's been done with them over the course of the early access period, but there's still some rough spots. There are plenty of times where you'll do everything over the course of your day, and you'll leave to go back to your camp, and something bad will happen. I've had thief attacks, I've had caravans on the road getting jumped that I need to try and save. I've literally had a character fall into a hole that turned out to be a giant smuggler's den, which then saw all but one of my characters getting murdered, and me scrambling to try and put my team back together because it was 2 days before a major bout that if I was not present for, would literally end the game. So I needed to figure out a way to get my team put together, and you know what? I succeeded, and it was very satisfying to find that success and be able to plan my way out of that hole. But in the moment, I was so pissed off. Because here we are, just walking home, guy falls in a hole, I send a team down to get him, we find a bunch of smugglers. They're not that hard. There's also a bonus objective to find a bunch of treasure. Like, okay, I can do that, that's fine. And then once the time limit is up, I'm told, okay, now I have to get my team back to the starting point. And also the reinforcements that are spawning are way more deadly than the initial enemies that were on the map, with no indication that that was going to be the case, at least none that I could see, which of course led to my entire team getting surrounded, picked off, and generally slaughtered before I could do anything about it, which was not something that made me very happy, especially when I was probably 3/4 of the way through the campaign at that point. So yes, RNG events can absolutely screw you over, and while they have gotten a lot better, it pretty much always makes a cold chill run down my spine whenever I try to finish a day and go back to camp, only to see the black screen that indicates that something is about to happen and a scene is loading. It's always scary, it's always stressful, and I don't know that the way these events have been executed on is ideal for the overall gameplay flow. It's way better now, and I think you can manage it once you know what you're doing, but it's not my favorite aspect of the game. I would be a lot happier if there was a little bit more of an indicator that something was going to be happening, a little bit more interaction you could have in terms of just trying to deal with it, or maybe just not have them present. I don't know. I'm not a game dev. I can't say what the best solution would be here, but I definitely know it was a pain point. Finally, and this kind of ties into the RNG events aspect, playing Together in Battle as a roguelite is just not a good idea, in my opinion. If you didn't know, you can play the game one of two different ways. It's billed as being a bit of a roguelite where every move matters. It's kind of like an Iron Man mode. You save after every action, all that type of good stuff. And you only get one save slot, so you have to very carefully plan out all of your actions to make your way through the game. That is the only way that I've played Together in Battle through all my dozens and dozens of hours of playtime, up until my most recent playthrough that I started as one that I could have manual saving and multiple save slots for. I cannot tell you the number of times that I regretted that decision for all of the reasons that we just referenced. The brutality, the learning curve, the frustration, the RNG events. So many times that I lost progress or was afraid that I was going to lose an entire campaign because I was playing it as a roguelite and I was not able to revert to a save to fix a bad decision or bad RNG or the like. Again, was it exhilarating when I did wind up beating the game in that roguelite mode and coming through all the different challenges and hurdles and tribulations that I wound up facing over the course of what was probably my 5th or 6th campaign that I had started? Absolutely. But I know for a lot of people, you're not going to be in for the long haul of that. So unless you know that you are someone that loves to spend all of your time fiddling and learning and restarting and mastering all of the systems in a game like this, I do not recommend that you play the game with the roguelite mode. Given the length of a campaign and given how many different things can go wrong in it, it can be fun for a very niche audience, but I think it will be an overall detriment to most. Now, with all those cons out of the way, what are my pros? Literally everything else. I love the world. I love the OST. I love all the different versatility of class design. I love the idea that you're fighting through a bunch of arena matches, so you have rules and objectives that fit in with what those arena matches would be, while also having other battles, whether they be the RNG fights or story battles or the like, that are much more classic, bigger, large map affairs with buildings and bridges and different terrain to navigate and patrolling guards and all sorts of fun stuff like that. I love the art style, I really do. I know it's something that people are generally put off by at first, but it really did grow on me and it really suited the overall feeling of the game. And I love the story writing, this idea, again, of being a sort of triple agent. You're a team manager for the arena fight who's actually a freedom fighter who's trying to push back against this corrupt mining corporation, and then you also wind up wearing the hat of a detective to try and figure out who killed the king, and also why they seem to be tied in with the people that are trying to hunt you down. Like, it's a very fascinating overall story, and I love the way that it's executed on over the course of the game. I love, too, that you can just completely ignore the investigation side plot if you want. It won't lead to a great ending, but you can do it if you just want to go in and experience the arena gameplay. And for someone like me who does like to replay these games, and I know a lot of you like to replay these games as well, that's awesome. The fact that there are so many different endings that you can approach from different ways by engaging with the game in different ways, that won't necessarily mean that you're forced to play the game in a way you don't want, is really, really cool, and something that I would love to see from more games in this genre. Though, of course, that is obviously a massive amount of work. I really enjoy the team management systems, balancing that usage of gold to acquire food and weapons and pay salaries, having the chance to actually go and splurge and maybe recruit a high power character or buy like a super powerful golem or something after you win your first major league match and get a huge amount of gold as a reward feels so cool. Being able to hit all your different thresholds to get promotions to different classes, to see what new skills they're going to get, how you're going to be able to patch up their stats, and how it's going to change the way that you play. Always one of my favorite aspects of any turn-based strategy RPG, and the way that the different classes are designed here and how they can interact with the world around them makes that even more special. Like, yeah, it's really cool in Fire Emblem when your Myrmidon promotes to a Swordmaster, right? And you get like a fancy new sprite, maybe, well, not for Swordmasters typically, but maybe you get like a different weapon that you can equip, fancier crit animations, boosted stats, maybe a couple of special skills, right? Depending on what game we're talking about. That's great, but what I love even more is when my Pyromancer promotes to a new class that allows me to throw fire from further away for more damage for half the cost while also getting a big stat boost and learning new skills in the process. Because the way the map is set up in a more grid-based Final Fantasy Tactics style, there's more room for that type of versatility, and it can massively impact the way that you play. And of course, mechanics are king in most tactics games, and that is absolutely the case here with Together in Battle. Hell, having, again, the engineer class where you can build bridges and put down caltrops and put up barricades as just a utility piece to support your other characters is so cool. I love having weird little niche versatility options like that. To say nothing of with the fact that, yeah, you can destroy bridges and make people fall off of them, or destroy a bridge to make sure that there's no longer a path to your squishies that the enemy can take. You can drop dudes in choke points and then flank around, destroy some trees, and have the rest of your team circle around and hit the enemy from the side after they stack up on your main tank in that choke point. You can use flyers to cross gaps and drop big bombs of fire on things. You can try to have a team that's filled solely with people that can freeze stuff to completely lock down the enemy and prevent them from ever moving while you pick them apart with psychic attacks afterwards. There's so many different ways that you can approach team building. I can only imagine how many hours of gameplay I could get out of Together in Battle, and how many you could get out of Together in Battle. You have all the different difficulty modes. You have custom campaign editors to build your own campaigns, custom character creator where you can insert anything and everything you want, from character bios to likes and dislikes and everything else. It's just so damn fun and so versatile. It is a sandbox for turn-based strategy RPGs, and that's not something that I'm really used to seeing in any way in the modern environment, which is awesome. There's a reason that I have like 80 hours in this game at this point. Despite the frustration and the learning curve, I kept coming back time and time again. Because when you land that big attack from a Sky Kineticist and watch someone become immobilized and softened so you can then run up with your assassin and shank the absolute crap out of them and blow up the big scary enemy team leader and suddenly push your way through to victory, is an adrenaline high in tactics gameplay that you don't always find in the genre anymore, and I absolutely adore it. You can tell that there's so much passion behind this project. You can tell that there's so much time and energy and attention to detail that's been put into it from someone who clearly knows the genre extremely well, and I absolutely applaud Sinister Design for what he has pulled off with this one. So with all of that said, who is this game for? Realistically, probably mainly old heads like myself. People who have a ton of experience in the genre, who know so much about different gameplay systems, different inspirations for them, how you can have different systems playing off of each other, being able to see the different paths for team building, team management, all that type of stuff. You need to be someone who can sit down and actually spend a lot of time with the game and let it teach you how it wants you to play it, and to be okay with that. It is slow, it is intense, and for a lot of people who've been getting into strategy RPGs recently through things like Fire Emblem, it might not be for you. Though, of course, I do encourage you to give it a shot. The game is currently only on Steam. It has a demo, so you can check it out that way. You can watch gameplay footage from those like myself. We will be doing a stream of the game starting soon, which we'll talk about at the end of the video here. You have options available to you, and I do highly encourage you to check it out, but it's definitely going to be a more intense experience than a lot of other games on the market that are in the same genre. For those of you who are more casual fans, it definitely might not be the game for you, but for all of you hardcore guys who are maybe a little bit older, who've had a lot of time with the genre, this one might be one that you really wind up enjoying, so I encourage you to check it out. All told, I've absolutely loved my time with Together in Battle, and I definitely see myself playing far more of it going forward into the future, just on my own time or on the channel as well. I'm very excited to see what else, if anything, Sinister Design does with any future projects, because he clearly has some very interesting ideas for the genre, and that's what we need more than anything. Yes, it's great to draw inspiration from the greats like Fire Emblem and FFT, but drawing more inspiration and creativity from other areas of the genre, as well as just having new, unique ideas that you can bring to the table, is what we desperately need as our genre grows, more people come to it, and there's a need for more new, fresh ideas and takes. As such, I absolutely do recommend that you check out Together in Battle. I give it a major thumbs up. I don't really do number grades or anything like that, but it definitely deserves a look into if you're at all interested, and I appreciate each and every one of you who has watched this far. If you have, this is where we're going to talk a little bit about my plans for covering the game going forward. I'm not sure exactly when this video is going to go up, as I've had a lot of schedule disruptions recently, and my apologies for that. This was supposed to be out, oh boy, probably like a week ago at this point, depending on when I think it's going to go up, but we will be covering Together in Battle on stream, and as such, this is where I get to tell you all that you can add characters to the campaign. I'll have instructions in the pinned comment at the bottom of this video, so I encourage you to check it out there. But essentially how this is going to work is my patrons and my YouTube members will get priority to submit characters for inclusion into the campaign. You should be able to choose at the very least what class and what character design you would like, and I will do my best to accommodate it. And you will also have the opportunity to potentially write up what you would like for your personality quirks and traits and all that type of fun stuff. And even if you are that dedicated and you have a PC to run it on, you could get the demo of the game and make a character file in it that you could then send to me to put directly into the game. So I'll have all the detailed written out instructions in a comment, so it's nice and easy to follow, a little bit of a tutorial there. You can check that out. And once all the patron and YouTube member characters have been included in the game, after that point, I will open it up to the general public so that if we do wind up having a lot of characters die and having to shuffle through a lot of different characters, some of y'all might be able to get in there as well. We're going to play the entire campaign. We'll probably play it on Challenging Plus. We will not be playing it on Roguelite mode because, oh my god. And then we're going to just get through the campaign as quickly as we can, and so I can have the chance to show it off to y'all, because it's definitely a fun one, and I think it's going to be a fun one to do together as a community. So look out not only for that comment, but also the announcement of the first stream. Should be sometime not too long after this video goes up. And maybe you'll even see Sinister Design himself around at some point, talking through, hanging out with y'all, giving advice, maybe giving me advice. It should be a very fun time. Finally, and of course, as always, as mentioned, thank you to my YouTube members and my patrons. You're seeing all their names scrolling by on the right-hand side of the screen right now. If you want to have priority chance to get a character into the game, of course, with no guarantees that we'll get through everyone, depending on how many entrants we have and depending on how good I am at not letting our characters die. But if you would like to have priority access to that, you can consider joining my YouTube membership or my Patreon. Links to both will be in the description. Those fine supporters are a large part of the reason that I'm still able to make YouTube happen on a fairly regular basis, so thank you all for that. That support means the world, and there should be a lot of other fun stuff coming down the line for y'all and for the rest of the community writ large. However, with all that said, this one has gone on far too long as it is. I have to start editing this behemoth, so thank you all so much for watching. My name has been Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman. I hope you all have a good night. Stay safe and healthy out there, everyone. And remember, be good to each other, y'all. Bye now.